welcome to today's edition of The Full Scottish. I'm Ruth Watson, and my guests today promise an action-packed conversation for the next hour. So welcome to Stirling MP Alyn Smith and Councillor for Inverleith in Edinburgh, Vicky Nicolson. Thank you very much for joining me today, guys. Look forward to our conversation greatly after the Ukraine update on day 578 of Russia's war in Ukraine. The United States has decided to supply Ukraine with long-range army tactical missile systems, an important boost to Kyiv's capacity to target Russian military logistics at long-range distances as the country prepares for a second winter at war. President Biden told the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in a private meeting that a small number of the weapons would be transferred. Ukraine has been asking for these weapons for months. Ukraine has reported breaking through Russian defence lines in the Zaporizhzhia area in the country's south, with General Alexander Tarnetsky, who is leading the counteroffensive, saying the advance is still underway. 9 people were killed and 16 injured, among 2 of them generals, in a Ukrainian airstrike on Russia's Black Sea Naval Headquarters in Crimea, according to the head of Ukrainian military intelligence, Cllr Budanov. Russia's defense ministry said 1 military serviceman was missing after the Ukrainian missile hit the headquarters in Sevastopol on Friday. Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, has said Ukraine's formula for peace is completely not feasible and that the war will be resolved on the battlefield if Kyiv and the West stick to the plan as a basis for negotiations. Lavrov accused Western powers of directly fighting Russia in comments at the United Nations. Lavrov also rejected the latest proposals by the UN Secretary-General to revive the Black Sea grain deal. Lavrov said, "We don't reject them, they are simply not realistic." Lavrov has announced he will go to Pyongyang next month for more negotiations following agreements reached by Russian President Vladimir Putin and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. The UK Ministry of Defence has said 3 successive commanders of one of Russia's most prestigious airborne regiments have either resigned or been killed since its invasion of Ukraine. Russian spies are using hackers to target computer systems at law enforcement agencies in Ukraine in a bid to identify and obtain evidence related to alleged Russian war crimes, according to Ukraine's cyber defence chief. Norwegian police have arrested a former commander of the Wagner mercenary group on suspicion that he attempted to illegally re-enter Russia after seeking asylum in Norway earlier this year. And Volodymyr Zelensky held an impromptu meeting with the head of the Sudanese Sovereign Council, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, when they discussed Russia-funded armed groups. The meeting took place at Shannon Airport in Ireland. Well, that's the Ukraine update. Looking closer to home, and net zero, it's some of the climate emergencies, something that everybody either is or should be speaking about across the world. The planet's on fire, and either Southern America in its winter months is now having the warmest, hottest winter that it's had on record. So while Humza Yousaf was in New York for the United Nations Climate Week, Rishi Sunak stayed in London to announce he was cancelling the requirements to improve energy efficiency of buildings, halting the end of fossil fuel boilers and rolling back the end of diesel and petrol cars. And much it has to be said to the fury of the automotive industry. I mean, Ford wrote a pretty scathing comments in response to that. I mean, in terms of the climate emergency, where does this leave Scotland if Rishi Sunak is rolling back? Does it make it politically difficult for us to our political leaders to move the climate emergency, our quest for net zero back? Vicky, Edinburgh, I was watching, there's a big stushy going on, whether the manufactured or otherwise, I'm not sure, about the Castorphin bus gates. I mean, active travel surely is one way that people in cities can make a difference. But where do we go with this?
Absolutely. I was very proud to see Humza, and then when I heard the comments from Sunak, it reminded me of what's happening in Edinburgh a little bit, the kind of culture wars and the using the climate to gain political advantage. the Lib Dems actually did vote in the council for the bus gate in Kirkstorfen and now are campaigning against it. So it just shows the kind of hypocrisy as well, um, with decision makers. They'll kind of go whichever way the votes are sometimes. I mean, before I was elected, I was a committed car driver. I'm a single parent, and it's always the easiest way to get about when you're busy, etc. But now I cycle. I still drive as well, but I'm committed to finding more sustainable ways for me and my family to get around. And I've learned a lot about infrastructure in the last year and a half. So it's very disheartening to hear this messaging, and it really undermines what we're trying to do for our future generations. If I'm lucky enough to ever be a grandparent, I don't want to have to explain to them about these disastrous decisions that we've made.
And when we're looking at, I mean, for example, Greece looks like some areas have lost 80% of their farmland, and there's talk of there now being permanent lakes in parts of Greece that were farmland. I mean, 1/5 of Pakistan was washed away in floods. How how forgiving are people on the doors? I mean, obviously, you say, well, sort of the Lib Dems are rolling back on something that they campaigned for, but if your voters, if your electorate don't want something to happen, where does that line between the duty of politicians to take unpopular decisions that are needed forward, and where does the democratic right for people's voices to be heard kick in? I mean, it's as you say, some of these things, the cultural wars being weaponized. I mean, Alyn, what do you see in your constituency when you're talking to people about the climate emergency? And in Stirlingshire is a hugely important farming area. There's massive issues for farmers in terms of soil health, biodiversity collapse, food security. I mean, where do we go with climate challenges in face of climate change and policies?
But, well, this is where leadership comes in, and there's politicians who pander and there's politicians who lead, and smart politicians do a little bit of both. And what we need to do is to, and I've had this argument with a number of Green friends of mine who are in the Green Party, and we need to give people hope that there are things we can do about this. There are things that we can practically do in our own lives, in our own communities. The best energy is the energy we don't use. So why are we not retrofitting all of our houses? Why do every single farm building in Scotland, why aren't there PV panels across all of them? Why are we putting good agricultural land? This is more a question for down south rather than here. But good agricultural land is being put out of production for photovoltaic panels. Now, land use conflict is not a new thing, but we need to give people a sense that there are things we can do about this. And there's an element of some of the Green movement that actually encourages the sort of nihilism that we've seen from Prime Minister Sunak over the last few days, that it's all pointless anyway, it's okay not to care. And that's really, really dangerous. And the only people who are applauding Prime Minister Sunak and his nihilistic announcements over the last few days are boneheaded idiots who really need to get with the times. And the fact that we've now got UK politics where the Prime Minister is railing against laws that don't exist, it's really, really dangerous. They're taking the very, very wildest fringes and then pretending that justifies this hugely retrograde step that they've made. And it's missing up an opportunity in terms of battery manufacture, which sounds a really arcane sort of area. The UK's barely got one battery manufacturer site. Other countries have dozens and hundreds. And in terms of how the energy of the future is going to go, the UK is really going to miss a trick on this. And our challenge, and certainly my and Vicky's part of the SNP, is to make sure that Scotland doesn't miss that challenge as well. And Scotland has had groundbreaking climate ambitions. We need to make sure that we stick with that. We need to make sure that we join the dots on the argument that net zero is not about just saving the planet. Well, that's quite a good thing to do, but it's also about the just transition from oil and gas jobs into green energy jobs. It's about lower energy bills. It's about more employment. It's about more sustainability within our own communities. And that's where we need to frame the argument. And there's a lot of doom and gloom around, and I see too many people just closing their minds to it all. And I'm afraid that's where Prime Minister Sunak's gone with his announcements. And we need to pull it back to a rational, no, we do need to do things about this. I mean, you talk about Stirling, because we've got in Stirling City, and obviously Stirling district's an awful lot bigger, but Stirling City, we've got the Forth that floods on a regular basis. With a big downpour just last week, at the top of the town, up towards the castle, was in floods for about, not for long, for about 20 minutes, half an hour. But while that flood was underway, there was all sorts of damage done to a few pubs, some residential areas. We need to get real about this stuff that's happening before our eyes.
I mean, when you're looking at some of the images coming out across the world, that's what really struck me this year. Is that across the world, there have been this catastrophic downpours of rain, like a day's worth of rain falling in a day, and in sort of city centres being washed away into the middle of German cities, the metro system flooding. I mean, really dangerous and scary stuff. Apart from the whole issue of the damage to people's homes and infrastructure. So, I mean, as you say, that is an issue for us here as well, especially when so many of the traditional floodplains have been drained and there's nowhere for this excess water to go, and often have been built on. Anytime you see a housing development called the Myers, it makes me shudder when I think of the heavy downpours of rain to come. But, I mean, in terms of diesel and petrol cars and sort of phasing them out, there are all sorts of sort of ethical issues to do with where these rare earths that go into the batteries are going to come from. And in terms of, I mean, I look at the price of electric vehicles, and I'm not sure that it's something I'm going to be able to afford in the next 15 or 20 years. You know what I mean? It doesn't come anywhere close to my budget, but I've got an electric bicycle now, and I'm trying to, do single person journeys on that. And the 20-mile-hour zones actually make it much safer for me to cycle because the cars aren't going at that much different of a speed. So, I mean, it's all very well talking about, well, let's take the train, let's take the bus. But in rural communities like the one that I live, it would take me an hour and a half to get to the one or two places, or 2 or 3 hours to get, to get to somewhere else. And it's just not feasible. So how do we take people with, you're trying to persuade people that there's ways ahead, for example, active travel, low emission cars, which all the evidence shows we need, not only for the health of the planet, but the health of our children and our old people, to cut dementia rates and all the pollutants that go along with it. So how do you, as politicians, put together a joined up transport infrastructure when we have, a system that's just really not designed to be joined up with all these privatized different companies and people out for profit rather than the well-being of communities? Vicky.
Recently listened to Leslie Riddick's podcast from Copenhagen, and I was struck by how far ahead they are with their infrastructure, but also how brave the SNP group in City of Edinburgh Council were in the last term, and pushing forward separate cycling infrastructure and really trying to work hard to make the city more accessible by bike for people. And at the time I wasn't elected and I didn't cycle, but now I really appreciate it. I feel so much safer on the roads when I know that there are bollards dividing the road and protecting me from cars, etc. And I just see that a lot of that good work is now going to potentially be undone because of the political will isn't there. And what Alyn was saying about, leading and we don't always please everybody with the decisions we make. So it's a real challenge to try and take people with you, particularly car driving people that are very committed to having their cars. My ward is quite interesting. I've got like quite high density tenements in one part, and then I've got very kind of big houses in another part. And so when we're doing like door knocking or asking people their opinions, the people who are living in flats want to see more cycling infrastructure. They want to see safe places to keep their bikes, etc. People that are living in houses with a kind of 2-car garage, or they're angry because we're impacting on their ability to get about easily. So listening to those messages and trying to please everyone is never going to be simple, I don't think.
I mean, it's a conundrum, but it's one that certainly needs to be sorted, because there's going to be more and more people who either don't want to or can't afford to drive cars. And so we're looking at the issue of infrastructure. I mean, it's one of the real British diseases is the inability of the UK state to invest in infrastructure before it's needed, and to fail to control the costs once projects are started. And looking from Crossrail to the new nuclear to HS2, everything apart from the fourth road bridge has been late and over budget. I mean, the A9, why was it not fully dualed in the 1980s? And looking at the prices of everything now, how will it be twinned and sort of fully dualed now, and to price and on budget? And looking at, I was having an interesting conversation on social media, because I was sort of railing against HS2 and saying this is yet another project that Scotland gets charged for and we get no benefit from and we don't get any say in it. And somebody said, well, actually, we do get Barnet consequentials, and it is supposed to increase capacity, so it should be increasing the ability for transport from Scotland to get down to England sooner. And I mean, he's a gentleman who generally knows what he's talking about, so I deferred to his great knowledge. But it seemed that HS2 is a bit of a pig in a poke. So, where do with infrastructure? I mean, Alyn, you've got some experience now, having been at Westminster for a while, to see the way that these things work. But I mean, is there any joined up thinking?
No, quite the reverse. And HS2 was born out of the right idea, but backwards. I'm fully in favour of HS2. I'm fully in favour of high-speed rail. I'm fully in favour of much more investment in proper European scale, European standard infrastructure for rail, getting freight off the road onto the rails. Also maritime transport down the coast as well. That's something that we should have done much more about over the last few decades. But they started HS2 backwards. They started it in London and then put it out. Start HS2 in Inverness and you'd actually get a road, a railway line that would be transformative for how we move around these islands. But essentially, they've spent a vast sum of money to make it about 20 minutes faster to get out of Birmingham, to get to the suburbs of London, where you'll then spend a lot of time going into central London. It's the wrong development in the wrong way, in the wrong place. And there's all sorts of lessons to be learned about that. But it isn't. And your point earlier about privatisation and the fact that a number of these things are now run by private companies, bluntly, whose job is not to provide a public service. Their job is to provide profit for their shareholders. And I'm a business lawyer to trade. I don't begrudge companies making money, but when we're talking about the public service and public services that need to interlock much better than they do, then we need to get real about regulation with teeth. We need to get real about what privatisation brings in terms of, as we've done with ScotRail, the opportunity to have much more socially cohesive pricing of the fares, which we're trialling just now, joining that up with the bus networks. And Stirling, as I say, Stirling City is pretty compact and easy to get around, but Stirling District, connectivity is the biggest single issue facing the people I represent, and people who are in the western, eastern, northern villages. The bus services are the only game in town if you don't have a car, and the bus services are not good enough for where we need to be. And if you're relying on buses, and I tried to get around with buses to see how they're doing, you only need to have the bus not turn up once, and then it's at the back of your mind every single time that you can't actually rely on it. So how many people across Stirling, across Scotland, are running cars that they don't actually want to run, that they can't actually afford that much, but because there's no alternative? So the socialisation of those costs into a publicly funded, publicly regulated, public-private partnership, whatever. There's all sorts of models that we can look at for this. But we do need to see the state in all its forms take a much more muscular role in setting what's needed in this stuff. And Vicky, I feel your pain on the bus lanes and the infrastructure in Edinburgh, where the Lib Dems being utterly shameless, supporting one thing, then railing against it. I mean, we put in with a change of administration in Stirling as well. It was a SNP Labour administration, and then they did a dodgy kind of supply deal with the Tories and hunted us out. But lots of bus lanes, rather cycle lanes, are getting put in throughout Stirling, particularly up to the uni, where the students are going to use them and cycle. And I'm getting emails from people saying, I saw that cycle lane and there was nobody on it for 10 minutes. And so we need to develop the actual network for people to use it. And once it's a network, it's a completely different thing. But my favourite phrase in a lot of this stuff was a Dutch MEP colleague of mine who I was saying, well, how did Amsterdam do this? And he said, well, Amsterdam wasn't always Amsterdam. It's just we made these decisions in the 70s and the 80s rather than now. So we'll get there because we're going to need to get there, and that's good for active travel, that's good for the health of the nation, that's good for emissions, that's good for all sorts of stuff. But behaviour changes slowly, and for me, one of my not irritations, but one of the things where I do part company with some of the more green politicians is it needs to be carrot and stick. It needs to be presented as this is a good thing that's investing in your life, your sustainability, the pleasantness of your environment and community. It can't be all finger wagging and stick. It has to be that this is a positive thing for us to be doing, and it is a positive thing for us to be doing.
But it also has to be affordable and achievable. I mean, I tried taking my kids down to Edinburgh for a day. I live just north of Dundee, and so I drove down because the bus. If we wanted to get the affordable train tickets. Now I know that you've got rid of, Scotland is trialing the getting away from peak time tickets, which is I think a brilliant idea. But in order for us to get down to Edinburgh on the train in an eco-friendly way, on the sort of the not peak time ticket, so that I could afford the £60 for the with my family rail card with me and the children. So we had to drive down because the bus just wasn't going to be feasible because it took an hour and a half to get literally 15 miles, and it cost me £14 to park for the day. It then cost me the £50, £60 for the train. We had 3 hours in Edinburgh because we had to get back on the off-peak things. And when I got back, I discovered I'd paid, well, my own fault, I'd paid at the wrong parking meter, so I had a £20 fine as well. So things like that, you kind of go, maybe I'll just drive the next time, But I, looking at what's happening in Paris. I mean, Paris, it was one of those car-focused cities in the world, has just gone, no, we're not doing this. Pollution's too bad. We're going bicycle, and you look at Paris now, it looks like Amsterdam. Living in Western Australia, the trains, you could get a train every 15 minutes that went through the suburbs. The tickets were really affordable, like $2 for a ticket each, which was brilliant. You could put your bicycles on really easy. And then the middle of town, it was all electric buses, and they were all free in the centre of town, and there were ample bicycle parking areas, and most of the bicycle lanes were completely separate from the traffic, so you didn't have this sense you might get knocked off by a bus wing mirror. So I mean, when you talk about being more robust, just how bold should the Scottish Government or local councils be?
Can I come in there?
Please do, Vicky.
So, I mean, I'm not an expert in major infrastructure projects, but I mean, we're very proud in Edinburgh that the next phase of the trams has been delivered on time and on budget. And I think, our last administration, which was SNP-led, played a huge role in that. And you can actually now take your bikes on the trams, although I can't at the moment because unfortunately my bike's been stolen, which is a huge problem in Edinburgh. So somebody got in touch with me when I first got elected and said, would you like to borrow an e-bike? And I thought, God, I've not been on a bike since my 20s. And I said, yeah, okay, why not? And I ended up loving it so much that I bought one and, classed myself as a cyclist after that. And I think that is a good way to, inspire people, unlikely people like me, not very fit, bit overweight, middle-aged, wouldn't be your sort of classic maybe person to expect to see on a bike. But, in trying to, lead from the front and say, if I can do it, then you can too. But unfortunately, probably an organised gang cut through my D-lock, and they must have carried it into a van because it had another lock on it that they wouldn't have been able to cut through. And so I'm in between bikes just now, and I think that until we have somewhere safe to put them, then we're going to struggle to get people cycling. So that, I think that's a huge part of the issue.
Yeah, I mean, and again, sort of just before we move on to the next, my husband, when we lived in Australia, I was really struck that his company made it very easy to cycle. There was a place, you could get company car parks, and within below the office block, there was an area where bicycles could be securely locked, where you could hang your lockers where you could hang your sweaty kit up and you could get a shower. So you could go in, cycle into work, grab a quick shower, get changed, and go looking presentable for work. I mean, it just seems to me that we've got a wee bit of a way to go before before we're really going to be encouraging people to make active travel choices. But I mean, looking at the UK economy now, I mean, obviously it's hard for companies to be making those kinds of decisions. But I mean, this week, the Bank of England held interest rates at 5.25%, warning of the UK economy going into recession. And yet the media are always reluctant now to mention Brexit and the damage it's done to the UK economy. There's a handful of people like James O'Brien who are perfectly willing to name the elephant in the room, but I'm fairly sure that there was an edict handed out by Number 10 a couple of years ago to say that sort of they didn't want Brexit being discussed, and it's astonishing to me how many of my former colleagues seem prepared to kowtow to government these days, and I guess in return for access to ministers. And there we see Liz Truss on her never-ending "I was right, it wasn't me, bigger boys did it and ran away." I mean, just how realistic, how difficult is it for companies and businesses now to be able to make any kind of plans? Looking at people trying to not lose their houses in the cost of living crisis. And of course, for international investors looking at the British Isles, I mean, is there hope, or is the UK economy now generally seen to be just a bit of a basket case? I mean, Alyn, what's your view on that? Seeing as you're down in the nest of vipers.
It's pretty grim, I have to say. I mean, what business wants is certainty, and they want certainty about what environmental standards they're going to work to, what trading tariffs they're going to deal with. And it was an Irish TD, Neil Richmond, who's a really smart guy. He's a minister now within the Irish government. His phrase has always struck with me, that trade's like water; it'll find the easiest way. And it will find the easiest way through whatever port's most amenable, whatever route's most amenable. And look at the way that post-Brexit, post-2016, Ireland's route into the European continent has massively altered away from the UK land bridge, as they call it, to much more maritime transport into the French and continental Low Countries ports. So trade moves. Trade will find a way. And sadly, what the UK has been doing to itself and us with it over the last since 2016 few years is just looking a bit flaky and a bit unserious. And much of the drama that we saw over the negotiations over the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, we've since seen key architects of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Now that's the main treaty that governs the UK's relationship with the EU. And that's about tariffs, that's about logistics, that's about opportunity to program. But many of the key architects of it have subsequently been trashing it. And there's people in Brussels reading that, there's people in the international community reading that. We then saw Liz Truss with the lunacy of her utterly ideological budget that was essentially trying to turn the UK into a completely different economy, but not within any consent of anybody. Within that, so the backlash to that was massive. But there are solutions to be found. I mean, I'm the SNP's representative in the EU-UK Partnership Assembly, Parliamentary Partnership Assembly between Westminster and the European Parliament, and there are there are small wins that are there to be done, and that's things like a veterinary agreement about agricultural and food exports, a phytosanitary agreement about food and plant health standards. That those sorts of things will make the borders easier. But what we've seen, you're absolutely right, is an omerta on the part of the three UK parties, and it's all the more tragic that there was so many thousands of people marching through London yesterday in favour of rejoining the EU at precisely the time that the three Labour, Tory, Lib Dems now even parties have explicitly said that that's not happening. So as the European EU accession spokesperson to the most pro-EU parties in these islands, frankly, I want a bit more credit from the European movements around the UK that, yeah, we actually are listening to you. We've got a really clear vision of what Scotland's best future is. That's getting back into the European Union. If while we're at it, I can help the UK have a better relationship with the EU, I'm perfectly game for that. I'd love to see the UK back in the EU as well, but I do not see the political maturity to actually face up to the scale of the problem and deal with the real world consequences of what the solution actually is, because the EU's moved on. The Brits are now a second level, third level issue that's not dealt with by the A team. The EU's talking about the war in Ukraine, energy security, climate change, what they're doing about the growth of AI, all sorts of stuff in those directions. The relationship with the Brits is now really not the talk of the steamy in Brussels. And you mentioned enlargement earlier on. The State of the Union address from Dr. von der Leyen has made quite clear that the EU is now getting serious about enlargement again. Now that's very welcome. The last two commissions were very much not about that. There was enlargement fatigue within the EU. Now that's not about us. That's not about Scotland. It is about the Western Balkans, and it's about the accession into the EU of other countries in Central Eastern Europe. But it does mean that there's an agenda that's moving. So from our side, the UK politicians need to get real about what the problems actually are. Now, people don't want to hear that everything's doom and gloom and Brexit's rubbish. Everybody knows Brexit's rubbish, and that's where I'm trying not to talk about Brexit so much. I'm trying to talk about what solutions might be in terms of opting back into Horizon Europe, opting back into Erasmus. We've seen action on Horizon Europe. We now need to see action on Erasmus. Touring visas for musicians and creatives, that would be a real concrete win, which we could get for an awful lot of creative people who are suffering from this. We need to talk about the tariffs and customs that businesses are having to deal with for no good reason, other than the UK has now found itself out with the customs union. There's ways that we could ameliorate that. So people do need concrete wins on this. But yes, there's an absolute parallel universe where the three UK parties are pretending that the biggest problem is not actually caused by the thing that's caused the problem. It's going to hamstring them in finding any sort of answer.
I mean, Vicky, I attended the SNP conference last year, and I was I was struck by the way in which every one of the panels, whether it be policing or health or Cllr, they had the representatives from the police and Cllr, and then the relevant government minister sitting up there, and it was striking how, following the Liz Truss Kwasi Kwarteng catastrophe of a budget, and the slashing that was happening then to budgets across the nations, just how disastrous this was in terms of the amount of money that was. It was explained to me that usually councils have got like a 5-year plan, and that 5-year plan, they'd suddenly been told your budget has been slashed. Like, in the next 6 months, there's pretty much nothing. And I mean, people genuinely looked grey with concern. I mean, how did that budget affect councils and the services then that we're, as as inhabitants of different councils, that we can expect to receive?
Well, it's not the easiest time to decide to change career and become a counsellor, I would say. Um, Financially, it's very difficult. So I live in the probably least affluent part of my ward, Drylaw, and I've brought my kids up here as a single parent. I'm seeing and hearing people struggling more than ever. I mean, last year I joined the board of a local community centre. I was also a community councillor here for 5 years before I got elected. And I've joined the board of the local community centre. We had warm banks last year. I mean, things this year look like they're going to be harder for people with energy costs set to rise again. And, the warm banks the council's funded, I presume we'll be trying to do something similar again this year. I hope so, because it was a good way to bring the community together and use that opportunity as well to, talk to people about maximising their income and making sure people were getting the benefits that they were entitled to, including Scottish Child Payment, which has been reported by a professor at Oxford University as significantly reducing child poverty, which is an amazing achievement in a cost of living crisis. I think we should be really proud in Scotland. However, families are struggling, and not everybody has children and is in receipt of child payment. So, every single person is impacted by the rising cost of energy, the rising costs in the shops. I mean, I see it myself. Just trying to feed my family is a lot more expensive than it was last week. I also sit on the Integration Joint Board, which is the NHS and social care boards, and I have a background in social care myself. We are really struggling to recruit into important roles that I myself used to work in: social work, social care, PAs supporting disabled people. And these roles often, rightly or wrongly, used to be carried out by people from the EU. And this gap in people to take on these jobs, and also in other sectors, I know, in hospitality and retail, etc. It's created a real disaster for us. We're not only are we, struggling because we've, after COVID, I think, which kind of papered over the cracks in health and social care and has now really exposed them. We're dealing with a lot more crisis rather than prevention, which we all know is much more costly, and we don't have the workforce to deliver the services that we need to deliver. So, yeah, I would say it's a challenging time. We've got a budget gap in the IGB in Edinburgh at present that we're looking to try and close before the end of this financial year. A lot of us are pulling our hair out and trying to work out how to do that. And it might mean very punishing cuts to services, unfortunately.
How dangerous do you think it is that the kind of poverty that we thought had been sorted by the social security system sort of post-war? I mean, we're talking about going back to the 1950s or 60s. I mean, some of the stats I've seen from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation talk about poverty that hasn't been seen since the 1920s. So it concerns me that, for example, when I was growing up, I thought that poverty was something which, generally speaking, there was a safety net. And my kids now have been brought up in an environment where food banks seem normal, and yet to me, it's an abhorrence, and it's utterly. I mean, I remember that hearing the first food bank opening up. I was living overseas at the time, and I'm like, food bank in Scotland? How's this possible? What's happened? And yet now, so how dangerous is it that there's this creeping normalization of misery and poverty and people, their expectations being lowered from actually, not being warm, not feeling full, not being able to feed their kids? How dangerous is that as a society? And what can we do as a society to demand change and make that change happen? Vicky?
It's devastating. I never thought that I'd be living in a community where people are, getting in touch with me and telling me they're hungry. And they're not. We talked about, people are having to choose whether they heat or eat, and now, there are literally individuals and families who can do neither of those things. So it's unbelievable. And I think what we need to do is look to our communities. I mean, I've worked in that kind of field myself, and I think that the prevention is key here. And because we're not in a position to really fund it, because we're dealing so much with crisis, we need to work out a way to re-establish preventative services. And I mean, I think the only way to probably do that is to fund both crisis and prevention. We don't have the resources to do that. I mean, we never probably will have until we're an independent country and we can borrow to really restructure the way that things are. Because, I mean, I said to you earlier that I'm in Inverleith Ward. It's a very diverse ward. You know, I think we've got more millionaires in Inverleith Ward than any other part of Scotland. But we also have crushing poverty streets away, and imagine being that child growing up without, you know, shoes or a winter coat and food in the cupboards, and knowing that there are children in the same school as you who've got, you know, a house in France. And it's just a really, really ill-divided country at the moment.
So, I mean, Alyn, we're looking at a part of the issue being, you know, because of Brexit, we don't have the diversity of workers. Because of Brexit, our young people don't have the same opportunities through the Erasmus scheme. Because of Brexit, we don't have that seamless trade and you know the food security. And as the climate emergency hits, and the EU will make sure that it's providing the more limited produce that there is because of the climate emergency will be going, so more of that will be staying within the EU borders. So the British Isles will be more of an outlier. You know, at the weekend, yesterday, we saw thousands of people with Rejoin EU, sort of marching for rejoining the EU. There's massive support for rejoining the EU within Scotland. All of the main British parties are all sort of Brexit with bells on. I mean, Keir Starmer, you know, I'm going to renegotiate Brexit. Like, I mean, it's almost like he's just sort of speaking to an echo chamber, because there's no sense of reality, surely, in any of what he says. So, and there's no prospect of Brexit Britain going back to the EU. What prospect is there for Scotland, Alyn?
Well, I'd strike a slightly more positive note in terms of Brexit Britain. There are things moving, and as I said earlier, there are concrete wins that we can get in terms of confidence-building measures in our relationship with the EU. But those discussions need to be had on the basis of actually understanding A, how the EU works, and B, where we fit in that pecking order of issues the EU is actually going to deal with. And my frustration with the Labour and Lib Dem positions, I mean, the Tories are the Tories. The Tories are a mess on Europe. They're split and fighting like ferrets in a sack. They don't understand what they want. They don't know what it is that's causing problems, but they're just going to shut their eyes and pretend that it's not the issue. But the Labour and the Lib Dem positions, it really has struck me since I got to Westminster. I was in the European Parliament for 16 years before I got to Westminster. The extent to which MPs of the Westminster parties really, truly, honestly do believe that the world revolves around that palace by the Thames, and everything is seen through that prism, is remarkable. And this is where I really can't fathom that, because when you're sat in Brussels, you're there in a parliament from the Algarve to the Arctic Circle, representing 500 million people with a really diverse range of political views, cultural views, political traditions. Many countries that only just regained their independence with the fall of the Berlin Wall, who adopted European enthusiasm as a way of asserting their independence. Within the UK, within Westminster, it's just so far behind the times in terms of how the world works. There is an implicit assumption that the world's going to do us favours because we are the Brits, we are special, and we're just not. So there's that. There's also the extent to which the EU itself has moved on, because the deal that the UK had is not the deal that the UK would accede back into if it rejoined the EU. So many of the things that we saw in the 2016 referendum, where David Cameron's pitch essentially was, yeah, we've opted out of all that integration-y stuff and all of that solidarity stuff, and we're carved out from that. It was a really half-hearted approach to EU membership, where in Scotland we really focused on the benefits of international solidarity, the things that we can achieve by acting as a bloc of 500 million people with lots of other different countries and traditions, and a way of finding consensus, where the EU is about finding consensus, where the UK is about winner takes all. The UK getting back into the EU is going to need to make some really tough decisions about freedom of movement, about budgetary contributions, about the role of the Court of Justice. And I don't see the political majority within the UK parties to deal with those honestly, because I think they'll pander to the worst elements of the press and media, and not actually face down and say, this is the reality of why we're the sick man in Europe, and this is how we'll go towards fixing it. So
I mean, they'd have to get rid of the House of Lords as well, because it's not a democratically elected chamber. So, I mean, it's on top of not having a constitution. I mean, there's a number of fairly big sort of sticking points there that I can't see the sort of I mean, a nation that won't even have a proportional representation for it just there's so many reasons why they're not ready yet, philosophically or politically, to go back into the EU. But I mean, we're looking at the election season coming up, and conference season starting. There's speculation that Rishi Sunak may go for a general election in the spring, but there's quite a lot of pundits saying he's going to hold on to the autumn because he's so deeply unpopular. I mean, as the SNP conference discusses the plan for delivering Scottish independence through a Westminster election in the absence of an independence referendum being granted us, how big an issue do you think independence in the EU should be, and how do you, Alyn, plan on selling that to the population of Scotland to deliver an independent Scotland back in Europe?
Yeah. Well, for all the reasons I just outlined about why I'm not overly hopeful about the UK rejoining and the UK parties taking this federal omerta, I think that actually makes the SNP's proposition that much more attractive. That independence is the way back into the European Union. We're not going it alone, as often comes up on the doorstep. We're not going it alone. We're joining something far bigger, far more progressive, far more modern than the UK is. We're internationalists in the SNP. We want to join the world as ourselves, make our own decisions at home, but also work with our friends and allies internationally towards the big macro common challenges that we're all facing. So I think that's a really energising, attractive proposition for people in Scotland. I've been doing a load of the EU roadshows with Stephen Flynn, Mary Black, and others up and down the country to underline to particularly an SNP audience just how the EU stuff underpins what our proposition is. And the numbers are quite clear that it's independent sentiments round about 50-ish%, depending on who you ask, how you ask, and it's bumping along there. But pro-EU sentiment in Scotland is 72%. So if we can get that 72% across the line for independence, that's how we win. And that's how we win with a modern perspective about getting back into the European Union. My role at Westminster is to make sure that we've done our homework on how that works, how all of that will function, making sure that we're not chasing after unicorns that are barely understood, which is why I launched this paper just last week on Scotland and the European Union, how it's EU membership, not as some are putting forward, EFTA or EEA, halfway houses that don't actually work and will give us all of the downsides, none of the upsides. I think we have a really appealing prospect for a lot of people. I think I can win Stirling for 70% for yes when we have a referendum. How we get there, that's going to be the subject of debate within the SNP conference in October. I think we've seen quite a lot of movement on that, and a number of the policy positions are now getting to a consensus that we're going to adopt Aberdeen. And that then becomes the strategy. And what that's going to be is going to be up to the SNP's members. I've got my views within that. I'm backing an amendment to the motion that's been put forward by Stephen Flynn and Hamza Yousaf, as this is what the strategy needs to be, which is winning the majority of seats, which gives us a mandate for discussions, but also a mandate for publishing papers about what the new relationship is going to look like, setting somebody up in Brussels to make sure that we're represented politically within that setup as well. There's a really exciting opportunity for the SNP in a lot of this. And I think the European question is what's going to get an awful lot of people in Scotland over the line, because many people in Scotland voted no in 2014, and this bit of the world where I am, Stirling especially, voted no not because they were hostile to independence, but because they didn't really see the need for change. If life's comfortable in Scotland, life's very comfortable. We're a great place to live. Many people didn't see the need to risk their EU status as they saw it. Many people didn't see the need to risk financial stability as they saw it. They thought that the UK was worth sticking with. Many of those people now are looking at what's going on in Westminster and the UK with absolute horror and looking at our proposition as being a modern, egalitarian, ecological state within the European framework as with fresh eyes. And I think we've got a really great opportunity to push that home over the next Westminster campaign and elsewhere and win our independence on that basis.
I mean, Vicky, it's often said, and understandably so, that people who are struggling to keep food on the table, or keep a house, people who are just struggling, and there's a theory that perhaps this is one of the reasons that we have such punitive policies coming out of Westminster for people, is that they don't have time to think about it. But one of the theories is that those who are just trying to survive don't pay attention to the wider political framework because they just don't have the mental capacity, because they're working 3 jobs. They're struggling every day is a challenge. How much political joining up of the dots is there among the people that you speak to, whether that be people who go to Valvona and Crola on a daily basis, or people who go to, which for those who aren't Edinburgh, is a pretty posh deli, and those who are going to the food bank just to try and get last week's mouldy courgettes because that's all they can get. That's what they've been reduced to in this pretty ghastly framework that we're living in. How live is the topic and the understanding of Brexit and independence and the EU and the potential for life getting much, much better if we became a modern European nation again?
It's a well-timed question, actually, because I was in Blantyre yesterday with Deirdre Brock, the MP, and we were doing the doors in a fairly, I would say, kind of working class neighbourhood. And people are really engaged politically in that area, and people were talking about leaving the EU, their kids not being able to live and work in Europe, the impact that that's had on their lives, the impact that austerity's had on their lives. It was really interesting. But these are exactly the people that we need to speak to and take with us. I know that, when I go round the doors, for example, in Blackhall, which is a lovely neighbourhood, very affluent, people know exactly how they're going to vote, generally speaking, and they ask really informed questions, sometimes too informed so that I can't answer them. And in other areas, a lot of people feel very disenfranchised and think that actually even voting is pointless because it's never helped them in their lives. And those are the people that we really, really need to speak to and take with us and make sure they feel that they're respected and they're part of the conversation, and that we want those people to have better lives, and not in a patronising way, just that it's not fair that some people do so well and some people do so badly at present. And those are my favourite places to go out campaigning. I can't wait to get started campaigning for the for the Westminster election and for independence, because that's what we do really well in the SNP. And the more people we speak to and hopefully influence positively by setting out what we can potentially offer them and their families, the better. So the sooner it starts, the better, Alyn.
But I mean, so in terms of a lot of these people that you're talking about, those who are disenfranchised or feel disenfranchised, are potentially about to genuinely be disenfranchised because the Tories have changed the voting rules and voter ID is a big issue. How much is that message getting through, that people need to make sure that they have, even if they've accessed some of the opportunity to get some of the free ID or going for postal voting? I mean, how is that message getting through?
Well, we're doing an awareness raising kind of campaign on an ongoing basis around that. What I did find really interesting at the council elections, when we were, just making sure that people had been out to vote on polling day, was the amount of people that had, even in the working class areas, that had used a postal vote. So that, and I think that happened during COVID. People were, worried, particularly older people, about getting out to polling stations, etc. So that's really helpful from an ID perspective. And, we would encourage people to take a postal vote if they, I think it is a way to make sure that people do use their vote. If your postal vote comes through, you're much more likely to use it. But as far as ID goes, yeah, I mean, it's obviously going to punish a certain type of person, and that's going to be a struggle. So yeah, we'll just keep trying to inform people and point them in the right direction of how to navigate that.
I mean, in terms of people being informed, I mean, it takes me on to our final story of the day, which is Rupert Murdoch. I mean, my goodness, that bitter old Aussie, he's managed to really twist the news agenda. I speak as a journalist of many years who has watched with horror as, I mean, local newspapers have been swallowed up to the point that, I think there's literally a dozen, 2 dozen newspaper owners in the whole country. I mean, the media now, there used to be a real diversity of newspaper ownership of broadcast outlets, and that has just been centralized and centralized and centralized. I mean, Rupert Murdoch, he's announced his retirement, but what impact do you think that will have on democracy in the UK and the US and around the world? I mean, given the viper-like grip that he's had. I mean, he once told a journalist that the reason he didn't like the EU was because nobody listened to him. But when he snapped his fingers, number 10 came running. I mean, how dangerous is it for one person to have so much of a monopoly on the voice that we hear, and how much do you think Scotland's people and Scotland's politicians should be doing to support a new version of ethical, independent journalism like Broadcasting Scotland? Alyn.
Well, I'm here talking to you. I'm a great supporter of you guys, and I think you're doing a lot of good stuff. But journalism, print and broadcast, is in crisis in the UK, and it's been in crisis for a long time. I've got pals in journalism who are having a really pretty miserable time because we think we get a lot of abuse as politicians on social media, online, but every single thing they're writing, they're getting it from all points of the compass, and it's pretty grim. Also, fewer and fewer people are reading the papers or watching the news in the way that they used to. And I've seen this change. I was first elected in 2004, 300 years ago, and I've seen how people consume their news change, particularly younger people. Time was that if you had an article in Scotland, if you had a story in Scotland on Sunday, or the Sunday Herald when it existed as an independent thing, or you were on Reporting Scotland, that was something that everybody saw, everybody heard. If you were on Good Morning Scotland first thing in the morning, you'd set the agenda for the day. Now hardly anybody reads or listens to these things, with good bloody reason, because by and large it's the same potted copy from the Press Association. It's, here's today's passing sensation, and everybody knows in their heart of hearts that it doesn't really matter because it's just fluff and blather rather than anything that actually, like this programme does, give people an opportunity to dig into stuff. I mean, but by way of example, even BBC Debate Night, which I think is one of the better efforts, Stephen Flynn was criticised massively by calling out one of the audience members as a Tory councillor. And it really is quite significant that the BBC is bringing in political hacks of all types. I mean, Nats, Unionists, whatever else. But if you've got an audience member, if you've got a Conservative councillor posing as an audience member reading out something from Party HQ, it looks like democracy, but it's actually kind of not. And the BBC's Question Time programme has not been a serious programme worth watching for many years now, and that's
On that note, we're going to crash our pips. So I'm going to stop you there, Alyn. But you heard it here. Broadcasting Scotland, it's the programme to watch if you want to have some good conversation. Well, that's it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who's donated and to everyone who's signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Our need to reach our £30,000 target to pay our bills is still pressing and urgent. However, the generosity of our supporters has given us a little more time. So far, we've raised almost £17,700, and we will be able to continue making programmes for a few more weeks, but our need to raise the remaining £12,300 is still really urgent. There's a cost of living crisis and it's hitting everyone hard. If you can dip down the back of the couch and see if you've got £1, that'd be really good. Thank you again to my guests, Alyn Smith and Vicky Nicolson. Thank you for joining us, guys, and thank you for watching. I'm Ruth Watson. Have a good day.